Good morning, everybody. Good to see everybody. We are going to begin with a song, number 627. It'll be our song. We'll sing the first and the third verse, 627. Just a quick note. Well, I'll tell you later, I guess. 627. Not old enough. We'll sing the first and the third. I'm in the way, the bright and shining way. I'm in the glory land way. Telling the world that Jesus saves today. Yes, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Hey, I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is nearer and the way groweth clearer, for I'm in the glory land way. Onward I go, rejoicing in his love. I'm in the glory land way. Soon I shall see him in that home above. Oh, I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. I'm in the glory land way. Heaven is near and the way groweth clearer, for I'm in the glory land way.
Okay. Says it's on. It's good to see everyone here this morning, and I hope that you've been having a good week. It's been pretty anyway, and I know that we're looking forward to where it gets pretty enough we can work out in the yard. Brenda's been trying to work me to death. Nah, I'm just kidding. We've both been working in the yard. I'm just glad it don't take forever to get the yard halfway straightened up. This morning, I want to talk to you about the leadership ability of Moses and how that God selected him. We talked last week about the providence, how that God, through providence, arranged all of those things to happen just the way they did. I know that there are certain people that that God has selected even from a youth. Think about David, King David. I mean, God had him selected as a leader, and God knew, since God is God, he knew what David was capable of. And he knew what Moses would be capable of. And so through the providence of God, we talked about how that it wasn't just an accident that Moses' parents put him in a basket and put him out in the edge of the Nile River, and right where the Pharaoh's daughter came. Obviously, that wasn't the first time she'd been there. You know that her being the Pharaoh's daughter or the king's daughter, that she's not just going to go out somewhere she's never been before. They're going to make sure that she's safe. And so obviously she'd been going there before. And maybe Moses' parents knew this. But they didn't know how she would react. Moses' parents, maybe they didn't know that Pharaoh's daughter was going there. I'm sure that the Egyptians made sure that men weren't coming along and just passing through. And so somehow, it was through the providence of God, Moses ended up where he did, and then ended up in Pharaoh's house where he was trained to be this leader that we're going to talk about. Moses, at the time, I would dare say, was the most educated Hebrew there was, because he had been trained, and they didn't just train, just for 5 or 6 years and then training was over. If you read about most of those ancient people, the men, like the Spartans, they trained their young men from 3 years old to 30 years old to be fighters. And in other groups, they trained their young men for a specific task, and it was for 20 or 30 years. And I would say that Moses got that same intensive training. And so he was prepared. But let us take a look. First of all, the call of Moses comes in Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. Now, I got this right off of a Sunday school card that a whole bunch of you folks remember. I'm not talking about the bigger ones they later came out with that would fold. They really weren't cards. But you remember those little Sunday school cards? The teacher would teach you a lesson, and it was all on the back of that card. I've got a whole stack of those that have never been opened. And then I've got a bunch that I've collected through the years. I never threw anything away back then, so I've still got a bunch I received in church. But here's the burning bush at the back of Moses. This is just an artist's conception of what it must have looked like. There's Moses' sheep sort of in the distance there. Moses gets curious. He goes over and sees this bush that's burning, but it's not burning up. It's a fire in it, but it's not, the bush is really not burning. And so he's curious, and we'd all be curious about something like that. So he goes over, and God tells him to take his shoes off. He's standing on holy ground. And then God begins speaking to him. And this is where he tells Moses what he has in mind for him. And of course, then we know through that encounter, Moses starts saying, well, I'm not a good speaker. I can't do this. And every time Moses had an objection, God he already had an answer for him. And so his brother Aaron is going to be the one. Maybe Moses had a speech impediment of some kind. I don't know, because God didn't argue with him about that. He just said, your brother Aaron can be your speaker. And so this is the beginning of Moses being commissioned as a leader. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 through chapter 4, verse 17 is the entire encounter here with Moses and God talking about what God wants him to do. And so Moses, one of the questions he asked God when he said, you're going to go back. You're going back into Egypt. And Moses, from the human point of view, he doesn't want to go back there because he's wanted for murder. You see, he killed an Egyptian officer, one of those men who was beating the Hebrew, and somebody saw him. And so by now, everybody in Egypt probably knew that this man that grew up in Pharaoh's house killed an Egyptian. I don't know that the Egyptians didn't know that Moses wasn't an Egyptian. But then maybe the daughter got suspicious and thought, well, this is, especially when Miriam says, well, I know somebody that can take care of him, be his nursemaid. And so surely she had it figured out. But the point is Moses now knows he would be in danger, or at least he thought he would, if he went back into Egypt. Now 40 years had passed, brothers and sisters. Moses was 40 when he goes into the wilderness. And he's 40 when God gives him the call, or rather 40 more years. That's 80 years old. Well, that's older than me. Almost as old as Hubert. No, just kidding, Hubert. But some of you folks in here remember 80. And you know, at 80 years old, you probably don't feel like going out and leading 500,000 people or 1.5 million or whatever. And so Moses said, what will I tell them? Who sent me? And of course, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, God tells him that, tell them I am sent you. And so, and then in this course of interaction, God reveals a new name. He reveals the name Jehovah. And that means the one who has always been, who is now, and who shall forever be. In other words, the eternal one. That's what the word Jehovah means. Sometime, maybe in our early Wednesday classes, and I'd like for us to study the meanings of the names of God. And you know, God's called by several names in the Bible. But every time that name was revealed, it revealed another characteristic about God. And that particular thing was needed in the lives of those people at the time that it was revealed. You know, he reveals himself in Genesis chapter 17, verse 1 to Abraham as El Shaddai. It's translated God Almighty. Abraham needed that. He needed to know that at that particular time. And there were other places where his name was revealed in some other way. But it was always at a point in time when the people needed that particular kind of help from God. And so I would like to do that. And while I'm thinking of it, next week will be my last week to teach the early class until the 1st of September. Because we're going to be out from school, and I'm going to be scattered all over the place. And Miss Gail, you may have to remind Brother Ronnie, because I thought I might see him today, but if you don't mind, remind him, and I'll remind Larry too. They both said that they would be glad to help this summer when they can. So I thought I better tell you that right now while I'm thinking of it. Okay, so then Moses said, well, will they believe me or they will not believe me? In other words, they know who I am. They know that I killed that Egyptian and tried to hide it and then ran off. They're not going to listen to me. But see, God has the answer again. Aaron is going to go with him, and they're going to go into that Pharaoh's court, and God's going to bring those plagues upon Egypt one at a time to teach the Egyptians who God really is. You see, the Egyptians, I think Pharaoh knew that there was a power a whole lot higher than he was, but he was too stubborn to admit it. And there's a lot of people like that in our world today. They know who God is. They want to kid themselves and say, oh, no, don't think there's a God. But deep down inside, they're like that old atheist. Chris, you may remember reading this or studying this, but the old boy that spent his whole life teaching people, Ingersoll was his name. Ingersoll wrote books trying to teach people that there was no God. Well, you know what he said on his deathbed? O God, if there be a God, save my soul, if I have a soul, from hell, if there be a hell. You see, he wasn't so sure anymore, was he? He was so sure all through life, teaching people that he was not a believer in God. And then on his deathbed, he comes around and starts saying, God, if there really is a God, save my soul, if I have a soul, from hell, if there be a hell. And so then, I think Pharaoh, before that last plague, I think he was already pretty well convinced there was a God up there, but I think he thinking, well, you know, I'm a God too. I'll figure out something, how to deal with this. But he didn't. And the last straw was when the firstborn sons of the Egyptians and firstborn of the cattle and everything died. Can you imagine what a horrible situation that was? And it took that to get him to finally say, I've had enough, leave. And then Moses, he brings up in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10 and through verse 17, saying, I'm not an eloquent speaker, Lord. I can't speak good. Well, that's never been an excuse with God, because, you know, Paul talks about how the Holy Spirit, there are things that we can't even utter. We can't even get them straight. But it's sort of like the Holy Spirit is a de-scrambler. He unscrambles what we're trying to say and gives it to God. You know, Paul talks about that in the book of Romans. And so, even if our tongues were cut out, our thoughts and are trying to mumble and everything, God would understand what we were saying. And so, he says, I'm not an eloquent speaker. But as I said, that didn't matter with God. Okay, first thing God told Moses to do was lead his people, Exodus chapter 3. By looking at Moses in the leadership role, we can determine what kind of leader Moses was. And so here's Moses now portrayed as leading the people. There's that pillar of fire by night, the column of cloud by day. And this is the scene where God's parting the waters. When Moses holds the rod up, God parts the waters, and they walk across on dry land. Not muddy ground, it says dry ground. So God did all of that. You know, the atheists and the skeptics, you know what they do with this? They say, oh, there was a strong east wind that blew this back. Well, isn't it interesting that it held it back until the Egyptians got in there, and then it let go? No matter how God did it, it was God that did it. It didn't just happen. And so, you know, there was a fellow here several years ago, got a lot of attention. His name was Hans Goedicke, Goedike, or D-Y-K-E. And he was a German. And he spent all of his books were trying to explain away all the miracles in the Bible. And so he was one of those that came up with this idea. It was a strong wind. And the quail, they were flying somewhere else, and they got blown off course by accident and ended up amongst the Hebrews. It's interesting there, it seems that they were there with them for a long time. You know, they complained about eating the manna, and some of us would never get tired of eating a cookie, would we? You know, that manna was sweet. It was like a wafer, and it was sweet. Some of us would just love having that all the time, wouldn't we, Chris? Brenda and I would too. But you see, they complained. They got tired of it. So God gave them the quail. But Moses was the cause of this. Moses' commission as a leader. We're going to read these following verses here. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? And what shall I say unto them? In other words, they want to know the name of God. See, they probably had known him just as El. A lot of the names, end in L, especially the men's names. Bethuel, and right now I can't think of a string of those names, but you know what I mean. As you start reading through the Bible, there's a whole bunch of those names that end with E-L. And the L on the end of it means something about God. What comes before means something that's connected with God. And so they knew him as El, and maybe one or two other names, but now they've got a new name. But when God says, I am, remember Jesus? He's asked by the Jews one time who he is or who his father is, and he says, I am that I am. And they were angry at him because he was claiming to be equal with God. And so names, it was important to know a name. And what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. In other words, I'm here because I'm here. In other words, he's saying, I'm the power. No other power put me here. I'm here because I'm here, or because I am. So I am that I am. And he said, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me. And God said moreover unto Moses, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. So then God is saying, you tell them I am sent me, or sent you. In John chapter 8, verse 57 and following, and this is what I just referred to. And the Jews said unto him, thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Then took they up stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed. And you know the rest of the story. That it says there that they were angry at him because he was claiming to be equal with God. In other words, he was claiming to be divine. And so even Jesus uses that name when they're asking him, well, you're claiming that you know Abraham, you knew him. Who are you? I am that I am. Okay, and Moses answered in verse 1 of chapter 4, and answered and said, behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, what is that in thine hand? And he said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. I'll get it wrong in a minute here. And Moses fled from before it. So it was real. Here's Moses, who's been out there now for 40 years in the wilderness, and he's encountered every kind of poisonous creature out there, no doubt, because he's a sheep herder, and he's not living in a nice house and going out every morning with the sheep and bringing them in the evening. He's out there sleeping with them. He might have one of those pup tent-like things that he's carrying around with him. But Moses is living in the wild, and for him to be who he is, and to see a real snake, and it must be, as my granddaddy used to say, one of them dangerous kind, he run back, he drew back. And the Lord said unto him, what is in thine hand? Well, we got that part. Let's see what, well, it doesn't. We know that God tells him to pick it up by the tail. When he does, it becomes a rod again. And so the idea is, though, is God is saying, I can help you prove who I am. And that's what Aaron is going to be able to do when they go into the court before Pharaoh. Pharaoh is going to want to know, who sent you? Who are you? Where are you from? Brenda and I have been to some churches, through the years, sort of like that. Who are you? Where'd you come from? What do you believe? So they're wanting to know who he was. Okay, Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto me, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. So you see, miracles, miraculous events are going to be God's, it's going to be Moses. God is giving it to Moses as a badge of approval. You know, that's how God, or Jesus, said when he was sending in that Great Commission. He talks about, signs and wonders will follow. Remember when Paul was shipwrecked, him and Barnabas, and they're coming ashore, and these people say, the gods must be angry at them because shipwrecked them. And then a snake bites one of them and they don't die. They must be gods. The pagan people, they change their mind real quick about something when they see something unusual. Well, in a sense, the Egyptians were pagan in the fact they didn't believe in the real God. They will not believe me. And so then, here's Moses throwing that rod down, and here's this snake. Maybe it did sort of, as we used to say, coil up and get ready to strike. But he springs back, he draws back, but then God tells him to pick it up by the tail. Now, I don't know about y'all, but if I find a snake and he's threatening enough to make me run, I'm not sure I want to get close enough to him to grab him by the tail. And so, but Moses does. I'm sure God there was making sure that the snake didn't bite him. Anyway, Moses picks it up and it becomes a rod again. And then he says, I am not an eloquent speaker. Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Maybe he was from South Alabama. When we were in England, Brenda couldn't make a long-distance phone call without being harassed for about 5 or 6 minutes. The operators would kept asking her, would you repeat that, ma'am? And come to find out, people that we met were like that. And we figured it out. They liked that southern accent. And our friend Phil Morgan from Benton, Kentucky said they ought to give you half price on those phone calls because it takes you longer to say something than it does most people. Yeah. In England she did. And so Moses says, I'm slow of speech. So maybe he was like we Southerners. Maybe he didn't talk so fast. In some countries, even the Spanish, when they speak, of course, if you've ever noticed, their vowels are their words are not as complicated when they're spelled out as ours. But they can just rattle it off, and they really are speaking fast. Moses says, I'm slow of speech. And the Lord said unto him, who hath made man's mouth? In other words, Moses, didn't I make your mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or the deaf, or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? In other words, I made all people. Now therefore go, and I will be thy mouthpiece, and teach thee what thou shalt say. Well, he's going to be his mouthpiece until he gets to Aaron, and then God's going to let Aaron be the one. So here's Moses head to head with Pharaoh. And can you imagine? I don't know. Moses by now knows what God's capable of.
How do we reckon
Yeah, that's in Acts chapter 7.
How do we reconcile Moses saying that he couldn't speak well, but Stephen said he's pretty speaker?
Yeah. Maybe God changed him. Maybe he dressed his speech up.
Oh, verse 22, he was mighty in words and deeds.
That was after he got into his work, I would imagine, doing what God told him.
Yeah. Yeah. I think God helped him. Because he said, who made your mouth? Who made all of these? Can restore sight to the blind, can restore speech to those that can't talk. I think of this, Chris, in connection with the Tower of Babel, there in Genesis chapter 11. You know, the first 9 verses, Genesis chapter 11, is about the people disobeyed God. They didn't scatter all over the earth. You know, he commanded Adam and Eve in the garden to be fruitful, multiply, and fill or replenish the earth. When Moses gets off the ark, what does God tell him? Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Well, Noah's people, they were hanging around over there in Mesopotamia, and they said, let us build us a tower that reaches up to heaven. And they didn't mean to where God is at. They just meant a high tower. Jews had 3 levels of heaven. The third heaven is where God is at. Paul refers to that. Second heaven is the sun, the moon, the stars, the outer space we call it. And the first heaven is right here where we're at. The air we breathe, the sky, the clouds, and all of that. And so they were saying, let us build us a tower that reaches up to heaven, and a city, and a name, lest we be scattered abroad. And so God comes down and he says, you know, they've determined this, and nothing's going to stop them that they've determined to do. In other words, nothing on earth, because God did stop them. But when he confounded their language, then they scattered in all places on the earth. Took God's interference. Okay, the reverse of that. On the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, when the apostles got up, everybody from every nation heard the gospel in their own tongue. That's what they were saying. How can we do this? These guys are Galileans. They're dumb as dirt. You know, Galileans were just mostly known for fishermen, and that's all, not educated. How in the world can these Galileans be speaking in the tongue in which we were born? That was God. Same God that confounded the language at the Tower of Babel could unlock it there on the day of Pentecost. The same God can unlock, a tongue that can't speak and make it speak. And so, I'm like Hubert. I think that when Stephen was referring to that, I think he was referring to later after Moses got into his work, because he didn't seem to worry about his speech after that. Any more questions? Any comments? He could have been, because we've seen people like that. My dad, he would just almost freak out if he had to get up and speak before as many people as this. You put a guitar in his hands, and he could stand up there and walk to the microphone. He could introduce folks and just talk. He was like Linus with his little blanket, and Peanuts. That guitar was his blanket. You put that guitar in his hands, and he could stand up before this group or hundreds, and he could talk. So he could really talk, but like you said, Mac, he didn't have the confidence until he had that guitar in his hands, and then he could come up and he could sing before hundreds of people. He could stand up there and talk, and he wasn't shy with that. But you take that guitar out of his hands, then he goes back into his almost introverted mode with strangers. And so maybe that was part of it with Moses. Maybe Moses, he'd been out there 40 years talking to sheep. Maybe he thought that only sheep could understand him. I don't know. But God used him. By the way, on this Pharaoh's crown here, there's a snake's head on one side, and there's actually, if he were looking at us, there would be a vulture's head on the other side. One represented Upper Egypt, one Lower Egypt, and they were united about 3200 BC under King Menes. And so they kept the symbol of both to remind them that Egypt is made up of two nations. Okay, from these passages, we see that Moses was a reluctant leader in the beginning. And again, back to the burning bush, I think this may be a Michelangelo painting or a Rubens, but here they've got God speaking from heaven. He's not in the bush. Maybe the bush in his mind was what drew Moses over there, but he's got God represented here as speaking from heaven. Moses is surrounded by sheep. There's one behind him, some in front of him, and there's his rod laying on the ground. Maybe that's where he's about to pick it back up. I don't know. But all these paintings, that impressed artists in the medieval period and in the Renaissance period. And there's been more than a dozen paintings of Moses there at the burning bush. Moses providing as a leader now his steadfastness in securing the freedom of Israel from Pharaoh. Here's Moses and Aaron before, and you can tell them from the Egyptians because Moses and Aaron's dressed in the typical shepherd's type, and everybody else is dressed like Egyptians. Aaron throws the rod down, and the snake, it turns into a snake. And those old magicians, they do the same thing. But the only problem was Aaron's snake swallowed theirs up. And so that was a sign right there that Moses and Aaron's God is more powerful than ours. See, they're still thinking like pagans. They still haven't accepted the fact that God is real. God's not just an idol standing in a stone temple somewhere. God is real. And so they're beginning to get a little sense of this. I imagine those magicians were getting a little intimidated now that every time they do something, Moses' brother Aaron, with God's help, can do something better. And so eventually those old magicians give up. Moses did not give up. He was learning to be persistent. Even at the Red Sea crossing, he never stopped believing in God's protection. Let me explain this, brothers and sisters. Where one of our brethren, J.W. McGarvey, who was in his day one of the clearest thinking brethren that we had, and one of probably the most scholarly brother we had living. Anything written by J.W. McGarvey is top notch. You can trust it because he sticks to the Bible. But he went to the Holy Land in 1882. And he spent about 6 months over there. And he walked from where he believed the crossing of the Red Sea occurred. He walked that journey around Mount Sinai, what they considered Mount Sinai, and then back to Kadesh Barnea, which if you read the story of the Exodus, Kadesh Barnea is one of the points where they were heading. And so McGarvey, the reason he picked this place, there's 7 things that the Bible speaks about that crossing. It says they got entangled in the land. In other words, they couldn't go back. And here's the Egyptian army closing in on them. Brother McGarvey believed that the reason they got entangled in the land, there was a mountain that ran right up to the sea on the south side. And they were coming from the north. And it's sort of a peninsula. And when they get down there, you know, they get out toward the sea, they can't turn around. There's water on the right, water ahead of them, and a mountain on the south. And the reason he believes that was the place is because right straight across on the other side of the Red Sea, 3 days south of there is where the waters of Marah was at. That was the bitter waters that they couldn't drink. And you go back and read the story of the Exodus, and all of this is given in detail, just like Brother McGarvey went to all those places, and he found places that fit all these descriptions on that journey. And so if that be the case, maybe they were crowded in as they were going out, because they could see the mountain, but they couldn't see that they were going to finally just be squeezed into a little bottleneck. And they couldn't go back because of the Egyptian army closing in. But Moses didn't give up. You see, he never stopped believing in God's providence or protection. God led them out there, and Moses believes God's not going to lead us out here and let us all die. He didn't know what he was going to do, didn't know what God was going to do, but he trusted in God. Remember Abraham? The book of Hebrews talks about Abraham's faith when God told him to offer that only son that he had. You know, God had promised that through that son, all nations were going to be blessed. And now God is saying you got to take him up there on the mountain and you've got to sacrifice him, just like cutting the throat of a sheep or something. And when Abraham got ready to make that strike on his own son, his only son, God held his hand. It says he stayed his hand. God knew all the time what Abraham would do. But Abraham didn't know what Abraham would do. He didn't know if he would sort of crumble under that and say, I can't do it. But he didn't. He was, as he drew that hand back, he was intending to kill Isaac like God said. But God stopped him. And from that time on, Abraham knew what Abraham could do when God told him what to do. And so that's the same kind of situation here. Moses has seen enough out of God interacting directly now that he believes that God's going to protect him. And so he does. And Moses said unto the people, Fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. That's pretty strong faith. Now the Bible doesn't tell us that God had called Moses aside and said, now when y'all get down there, I'm going to take over and I'm going to part the water and you could go on across. There's no indication that God had told Moses anything. You see, Moses' faith told him that God's going to protect us some way. He didn't know how, but God did. He parted the waters and they go across. And here's another picture here. And I'm sure whoever did this picture, they got carried away because they've got soldiers. The Hebrews were not soldiers. They'd been shepherds, they'd been brick makers, they'd been all kinds of slaves. They didn't have armor and things. That was another reason they were afraid of the Egyptians. They couldn't protect themselves. But anyway, just sort of cut that soldier on a horse out, and something like this, no doubt, occurred. Only the Ark of the Covenant wasn't at the crossing of the Red Sea, was it? It hadn't even been invented yet. You have to go to Exodus chapter 20. I think that somebody got this mixed up with their crossing of the Jordan River. By then, yes, they had learned how to fight with God's help. And so that's what I think this is. But it was titled, when I downloaded it, it was titled Crossing of the Red Sea. His providing in the wilderness, Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 14. The people prematurely blame Moses for their deaths. Did you just lead us out here in this wilderness to starve to death, to thirst to death? We don't have water, we don't have food. But you know, Moses didn't let that stand in the way. He did get discouraged, though. And I guess any leader would get discouraged when everybody's complaining all the time. And that's what was happening here. They were murmuring. And that's just sort of a kind word, for they were really griping and complaining. But Moses, with God's help, got through. The people complained to Moses over the lack of water. And so God tells Moses this first time to strike the rock, and water comes out. Well, you know the story later on in the march, maybe a few months or a year or so later, they don't have any water. They complain. And by this time, Moses has been pushed to his limits in his ability to stay calm, I guess. And he gets angry. And God says, Moses, speak to the rock and water will come out. And Moses is so angry, he hits the rock. Water comes out. But Moses loses his opportunity to go into the promised land. Because on that occasion, his anger overcome his faith. And out of anger, he hits the rock. I wonder if when he hit it immediately, oops, I made a mistake there. But you see, Moses, for the most part, was calm with the people. He could handle the complaining, but it had finally, I guess, the straw that broke the camel's back. And so Moses then, the second time, hits the stone and water comes out. But they say, we don't have any food. What shall we eat? Moses' patience is being tried, murmuring again and again. And then God sends manna, and they're gathering manna. But they had to gather enough on Friday for Saturday, because remember, their day of worship under the old covenant was on Saturday, the Sabbath. See, that was changed in the new. I think that was changed because we had a new covenant, the new covenant with Christ. But anyway, they complained. And so again, the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and we did eat bread to the full. For ye have brought us forth into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Going to starve us to death. Numbers 20. Here Moses loses his patience with the people. Here God tells him to speak to the rock, and what does he do? He strikes the rock. And so then God says, Moses, you're not going into the promised land. You can see it, but you're not going into it. And here's where Moses is passing that mantle of leadership on to Joshua. Because Joshua is going to be the man that succeeds now. Moses is going to die at 120 years old. And he's going to be buried up there where nobody but God knew where he was buried. And the point here is Moses knew, and he lived another 40, well, I don't know how many years they'd been in the wilderness when he struck the rock, but several years it took Moses before he reached the point God said, Moses, it's time. It's time for you to come and be with me. And he did go and be with God, because who appeared with Jesus on the Mount of Sinai? The Mount of Transfiguration. I was trying to say resurrection. It was Moses and Elijah. They appeared right there and talked to Jesus. So then, and there's Aaron standing in the background. See, he's a high priest now. He's got that ephod on and got that little turret on his head. All of this, but this is symbolic of Moses passing the torch, you might say, to Joshua. Are there any questions before we close this? Any comments? Brenda, do you have any comments? I picked on her, so she's got to have a rebuttal here. Okay. I believe River Botter, I can't even talk. I need Moses' help today. The River Bottom Grill for anybody that wants to go and eat with us. And so we'll collect down there when we discollect here, I guess. I want to thank you for being here. And we're going to ask Brother James to lead us in a prayer. And then we will proceed to the river bottom. Oh, it's Brother Hubert. That's right.
Father, thank you so much for this day and the opportunity we had to learn, Wayne, from you, Father, through him. Thank you so much for your word, and thank you for showing us these heroes of faith in the book of Hebrews, and how, especially Moses, and how he led the people with your guidance and your help, and only for that way was able to do that. Thank you so much, Father, for all these things in the ancient history that have been passed on to us, that we can study them and learn from them, and maybe improve our lives by them. Help us as a country, Father, to do better and stand within your will. Thank you for the possibility that abortion laws can be changed. Give us our sins, Father, and Lord, us through this day. We thank you in your Son's precious name.
Amen. Again, thank all of you for being here. I didn't count, but we got 3. Did you count them, Lisa?